Good morning, Nicole. Mhm. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Coffee Chats. We'll get started here in a moment or so. We're just letting a few more folks in from the waiting room. So if you don't already have some, grab some coffee and we'll get going on this real soon here. Thanks. Okay, we are ready to go. Good morning, everyone. My name is Gary Hoff. I'm with Economic Alliance, and thank you for joining us for Coffee Chats. Gosh, this is well, it's nice to start the week off with a Tuesday, but this is going to be a very interesting week with everything that's going on in our nation and such. So I hope everybody's staying safe in more than one way. The topic we have this morning is very interesting, and I'm hoping that it will trigger a lot of questions. A couple of housekeeping items for you folks. First of all, we will be recording this webinar this morning. So if you need the recording afterwards, you want to share it with other folks, please let us know because we'll make that available, as well as the slides that our presenter will be presenting. We'll make those slides available to you as well. And as always, we want any kind of participation. So if you have questions, comments, whatever that looks like, please drop them into the chat between myself and Katie. We will be monitoring that chat and we'll keep those questions and save them till the end. We will have a hard stop right at 9:30. So I'd like to jump right into this and introduce our speaker this morning. This is Reeves Clippard. He is the co-founder and CEO of A&R Solar. And A&R Solar is creating a clean energy future by installing solar for homeowners, businesses, communities, and governments across Washington and Oregon. Most recently, he was appointed co-chair of the Washington State Energy Strategy Advisory Committee. That's a tongue twister. And then over the last year, he's collaborated with stakeholders across the state to guide the Department of Commerce in the development of the state's energy strategy. And Reeves is also the board chair of CleanTech Alliance, and I'm hoping that Reeves will give us a little insight on that. That's another one of our partners as well. So with that, Reeves, I'd like to welcome you and turn the mic over to you.
Great, thank you so much for the warm introduction and having me here this morning. I'm going to go ahead and share some slides here, get us started. I'm going to assume that they work, and if they don't, just let me know.
It looks good on this end, Reeves, so you're
Perfect.
Good to go.
Excellent. And if there's any background noise, I've got a couple of twin boys at home who are currently enrolled in virtual school here in Seattle. And the rest of the house is getting going as well. So as mentioned, I'll be talking about the Washington State Energy Strategy today. All the materials that I'm presenting are actually based on the materials that were published by the Department of Commerce. And I hope to just provide some insight behind them, give you a good overview, and then if you're interested, I'd highly encourage you to look into the details. Because there's a lot there, and everyone in Washington is going to be affected. So it's good to be able to kind of get a forward look into how things might change for your business and your community. Gary, thanks for providing all of my bona fides. Just so y'all know who the CleanTech Alliance is, we've got several hundred members of companies of all scales and sizes who are either working in clean tech sectors, such as myself in solar, or related services. And I think currently we have members in four states and 3 provinces in Canada. As changing up, maybe it's 11 states and 3 provinces. It's changing all the time. We're growing quite rapidly. And we have people, it's like utilities. So there's a lot of interest in electricity. We have utilities, we have small entrepreneurs. We have people that are working internationally, manufacturers, as well as ag tech. Clean tech is a really big umbrella. We encourage all kinds of people to get involved. In addition to my day job and my hobby of being chair of the Clean Tech board, I'm also on the board of Farm Power Northwest, which is a dairy biodigester company that turns cow manure into renewable gas and electricity. With that, I will go ahead and jump in. So the energy strategy is developed. It's set in law that it's an 8-year cycle. Every 8 years, Commerce is supposed to convene a group of people to look at what's coming. How has the energy landscape changed? So that includes things like population, where the population is, what's happening economically, and just update that strategy. And honestly, like, a lot can happen in 8 years, especially these days. And so I would love to see some more updates along the way, but it is a big effort from a broad group of people. So the purpose is to guide policy, business investment. The strategy looks out 30 years. So we were modeling out until 2050, and what actions need to be taken now in order for us to be successful. And how do you avoid dead ends where maybe there's an overinvestment now, but those technologies become stranded as new technologies become available or more economic. One of the things that I love this, so I'm a really big data guy, even though I'm a contractor. I love to think about data, getting as much information as possible to make informed decisions so you can really understand the trade-offs. And the strategy is really based in the technical modeling. So the state hired a really great technical group to go through. The basis of the study is called the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Study. There's been a number of studies around the Northwest, specifically just for Washington and the Northwest as a whole. And then these studies were updated again as part of this process. One of the great things about this is there are no magic wands in there. We're not, the technical team was not assuming that some unknown technology is going to swoop in and save the day, right? So there's a lot of interest in, say, like SMRs, if you follow nuclear, coming out of Idaho National Laboratory. The thing is, we just don't know costs and maintenance cycles and things like that yet. So those were not included as a technology in the strategy as we're trying to decarbonize Washington. One of the good things is that this is not a prescriptive document, right? You can see the quote from the state here. It's to provide a roadmap. So you can see some of the constraints that we're operating within. There are multiple pathways to get to where we're going. And this is such a large and complex problem that, as you all know, as you're doing strategy for your company, it's the planning process ends up being more important than the plan itself. And so a lot of great stuff was discovered. That last bullet point down there, that's a little bit of a word soup, but there are statutory limits on greenhouse gas emissions. And I'm going to illustrate those for you here in just 2 slides, make it a little bit easier to understand what it is we're trying to achieve as a state. But first, a little bit of the process. As Gary mentioned, I was appointed co-chair along with Nancy Hirsch from NWEC, the Northwest Energy Coalition, who was a phenomenal co-chair. She and I were also on the steering committee, working with the technical and facilitation teams to do this. Along with us, there are 27 advisory members from all corners of Washington. So we had representatives from industry, cities and counties, utilities, CleanTech businesses, manufacturing, tribal interest, agriculture, potato commissioner was there, some legislators, quite a broad group. There was additional outreach, so we can't assume that those 27 of us actually know enough to be able to answer all the questions that come up in a process like this, as well as an analysis of where is current policy. Do we already have policies in place that are going to enhance or detract from achieving these goals? And not only is that what policies in place in Washington, but let's look nationally. What's happening in the Northeast? What's happening, further south on the West Coast? What can we learn? What are the victories and what are the failures of policy as states are trying to achieve decarbonization? I mentioned the technical modeling. I'll get into that again in a moment. The technical advisory process was a lot of interviews. This is where the subject matter experts were pulled in. And then the strategy development. And at this point, what I want to say is, so we were given a year. Commerce was given a year to convene this advisory board, develop the strategy, and have us respond to the strategy and shape it as best we could to reality. This was an exercise in building the plane while you fly it. As one of the facilitators said, one of the keys to success in his life has been, pants first, then shoes. And this was definitely a process we were trying to do both at the same time. So there were a lot of challenges there, but I think the team did a really phenomenal job of synthesizing just an incredible amount of information and opinion, expertise to get the modeling done, revise the modeling, develop the strategy, get the drafts out, and synthesize the responses and the comments that were given, not just from the advisory committee, but the community at large. And so it was not a perfect process, but again, I really think the results are really high quality and really informative. This is a transformational energy strategy. The state of Washington has said business as usual is not allowed. We have to take action to decarbonize our economy, and it's going to be challenging, but we can do it. And the great thing is the technical modeling supports that yes, this is achievable. And so what you see here, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but looking at the break, you can see our historical emissions, and then a vast drop there as we hit COVID, because not only was the process hard to conclude in just under a year, after our very first meeting in March at the Seattle at CTAC, COVID hit, and the rest of the process was done virtually. And so that made for some epic days on Zoom, 7 and 8 hour days on Zoom, to go through the technical information, to respond, answer questions that Commerce needed answers for to develop the strategy. But one of the really cool things that came out of that is the amount of engagement that we got from people that we might not have gotten engagement from, right? So, suddenly it's a lot easier for someone from Eastern Washington to participate. They're not having to give up a day to travel over to the West Side, attend the meeting, and then travel back. Those are real and serious barriers to engagement, as I'm sure a lot of y'all are learning as you think about equity within your organizations. which is another great thing, is more people were able to participate and listen from home and provide their input than ever before. And so I think the strategy is better for that. So that word soup that I was talking about a couple slides ago, that's the right side of this chart here, right? The business as usual is that reference scenario across the top, that dotted line. And then the dotted line at the bottom, where you see electrification scenario, is what we're trying to achieve. And the colors are how much carbon needs to leave each one of those industries. So you can see the bulk of this is happening in transportation, liquid fuels, burning gas to get places, vehicle miles traveled. A good chunk is industry. I'll talk about industry a little bit here to provide a little more insight into industry. And then even though you see residential and commercial here, these are the spaces that I work mostly in, are a thin slice. You have to think that building stock does not turn over very quickly, right? The house that I'm in right now is, gosh, what am I, 70 years old now. There's a lot of homes much older. The buildings that we're operating in, you just don't turn that over very often, and retrofitting and updating these homes and buildings that we occupy can often be pretty expensive and tough to do. So the lift in these spaces is going to be pretty high as well. So I mentioned data modeling, and already I've inferred, you know, there's a reference case and electrification case. I'm going to go through each of these just so you can understand the thought process of the state as it went through. So again, the reference case is just based on current policy. You know, there are policies in place that will change the energy landscape and our economy to hit greenhouse gas emissions goals. So we're assuming that we're able to execute on that in the reference case. And you can see that that just takes our emissions flat, but we need to do so much more. And the electrification case, if you've been following what's happening in the energy sector, there's a big push really worldwide to electrify everything, right? This is to get into electric vehicles, move away from natural gas. That is the scenario, which turns out to be the lowest cost scenario across all of the scenarios. But notice that it relies a lot on out-of-state generation, right? So this is kind of a vision of an interconnected West, where we're able to bring solar resources from Arizona onto our grid by expanding transmission north to south, and that we're able to bring wind in from Montana and the Dakotas because we've got additional transmission going from east to west, and vice versa, and that our hydro resources are able to firm up other resources in California. And so we have this large interconnected kind of global scale of technology enabling not just Washington to achieve 100% clean goals, but the other states in the West, where more and more states are starting to set these targets. And so the way this modeling worked is like, well, you know, some of that's a pipe dream. Getting transmission built is incredibly difficult and takes decades. It's very expensive. So what happens if we're not allowed to do that? Well, we have a constrained resources case where we take a look at that. What does that mean for Washington? Can we still meet our goals? Same thing within transportation fuels. What if we can't electrify everything that we want to electrify? Well, then we're going to need more synthetic fuels, or fuels where the carbon molecule has been removed, or carbon dioxide is removed on the outside. And so we need more synthetic fuels, more hydrogen. That was one of the surprising things, I think, for a lot of people, especially the energy wonks that were associated and working on this plan, is how hydrogen actually plays a pretty serious role in the future. Gas in buildings, there's a lot of debates. You hear City of Seattle is trying to ban natural gas in all new buildings. You know, what happens if we're not able to do something like that? What if you can't get rid of natural gas? What if we don't want to get rid of natural gas? There's a lot of infrastructure there in that pipeline that has a lot of value. And maybe it's better for Washington to fill those pipelines with renewable natural gas, synthetic gas, and hydrogen, rather than eliminate it altogether. And then, of course, behavior change. You know, if you think about this drop here between beginning of last year and where we're at now, one of the best comments I saw from one of my colleagues on the advisory board is, let's do this by design rather than by disaster. I think we can all empathize with that in our own businesses when we think, you know, you get through a disaster and you think, well, what are the good things we can take from that and move forward? And so behavior change is really powerful, but it can be really difficult too. And you can't always count on it. But so you have a sensitivity analysis there. And then I mentioned constrained resources. What if we can't build out this amazing interconnection across the West? We're going to have to build all those resources here. And what does that look like? You know, yes, more solar in Washington, not just on the east side, but more onshore and offshore wind. Upgrades to hydro. What are the cost implications of that? From a energy standpoint and from a broad economic standpoint? So after going through this process and, you know, a couple of rounds of drafts and public comment, public input, there are some key actions that can be summarized. And again, I'm going to encourage everyone to go to the website. I have a link to it at the end, or you can just search for Washington State Energy Strategy and look at the bulk of the document and the appendices if you really want to go deep. It's a really well organized. There is a lot of information in there. Each sentence, I think the final document is about 150 pages long, but it's organized by sector. Each sentence contains important information. At any rate, the key actions, so talking about that organization and sector, it ends up being organized into 4 different sections. You have transportation, buildings, industry, electricity, and then what were considered cross-cutting issues, which turns out to be a lot when you were trying to change an entire economy. But an example of that might be equity. You know, how do we think about equity in all of this? Not only is it about participation and workforce was a cross-cutting issue across everything. You have participation, I may have mentioned ownership, and just what does even a stakeholder process look like? We hear a lot of great things these days about what we want to achieve with diversity, equity, and inclusion goals, but what is a process that we can all agree to use in order to make sure that these issues are addressed at every step of the way? I'll call out some other cross-cutting issues that I found really fascinating as part of the process and a little bit surprising. But right here at the top, you can see within the communities section is adopting state policy for universal broadband access. And this is something that specifically came from COVID and just an underlying urgency that not every community in Washington is able to participate in the economy equally, that we found during this pandemic. Children don't have access to education, adults don't have access to education and work opportunities. And there's some real gains to be made through vehicle miles traveled, where I'm not spending an hour and a half in the car every day getting to and from an office, where we've become very effective at working remotely. So what does the future of work look like? Not only are we talking about equity there, but we're also talking about information flow. And what we're trying to achieve here is not going to be possible without data, transparency, and access to information. I mentioned the policy here and equity impacts, providing funding. So this is something that I've learned about recently. I always thought about equity and clean energy at any rate through workforce development, participation, such as getting the economic benefits of a particular project like community solar, or ownership, you know, direct investment in solar in order to benefit the person. But there's a fourth leg to that, which is just stakeholder engagement. And so often in a lot of these most impacted communities is they don't have a voice at the table because there aren't resources to be at the table. I'm lucky to work for a company where they will allow me and pay me to go and participate in processes like this. That's not true for everybody. And so that's kind of where this policy is getting to. And then worker transition was big. I'll talk about job impacts here in a moment. But there's a number of industries that will no longer be around. It happens. We're no longer in horse and buggies, and not planning on going back there. And we no longer have a whale oil industry either. Those aren't necessarily bad things. So how do we transition people gracefully into other jobs, or at the end of their career, how do you transition them gracefully into retirement? There's a lot of work around this that I'm not super familiar with called Just Transition that talks a lot about these equity issues if you're interested in exploring that more. So within transportation, notice that that was one of the biggest things that we need to tackle, and there's only 2 key actions here, but these are really hefty. When you see specific targets for vehicle sales, transportation demand, accountability measures here, in order to achieve the transmission, and you can get into the transition and electrification, and you can get into the data, you'll see that really to achieve the transportation goals, we need to have 100% of passenger vehicles sold in Washington by 2030 need to be EVs. That is a huge effort that has really broad impacts. And then we need to move on to light duty and heavy duty and figure out ways to either electrify them or move them into synthetic fuels. And one of the reasons you have to think is, like, once we get to 100% vehicle sales, we still have cars that are sitting in our driveway that we don't want to get rid of, right? We've paid them off and you don't want to send it to a landfill, but it's going to take time for that stock to roll over all the way until 2050. And so one of the mechanisms to achieve that is a low carbon fuel standard. And so this is really successful in other states and has been for some time. And it just gives a price signal. It's a technology neutral way to say, well, maybe EV is a good way to go, but maybe so is compressed natural gas or renewable gas or something else. And so it just gives a price signal and allows people to participate with where their technology is. One of the interesting things that came out of transportation for me is also urban planning. I remember when Snoqualmie was a sleepy mountain town, and now it is a bedroom community with hundreds of homes. And one of the things that I like about some of those communities is they have, central commercial area, grocery store where people can walk to. But when I go out to Post Falls, Idaho, just outside of Spokane, and they're building these mega communities, they don't have that, right? So you're already locking in a population of people of needing to drive, 20 to 30 minutes in order to get to their groceries. So there's some cross-cutting issues there that are difficult. Another one is healthcare. So I was talking with a representative from Eastern Washington who lives just outside of Moses Lake. Well, if you have a Leaf, right, you have about a 75-mile range right now with the current Nissan Leaf. If he wants to get to his doctor, he doesn't have an in-network doctor in his community. He has to go to the next town over. So he doesn't have enough range in an EV to get to the doctor and get home. And so do you change healthcare and what network looks like, or do you change the range, or do you change the technologies that are available on the way? So again, really complex stuff, but really fun. If you're an entrepreneur, these are some fun problems to try and solve. So within buildings, and Gary, I'll say I'm not watching the time. So if I start going long, just let me know. So within buildings, again, I mentioned the long, slow turnover. There's a lot of excitement for me here, again, just because this is the space that I work in day to day. You can see here replacing the direct consumption of fossil fuels, which right now is primarily natural gas, with heat pumps for space and water heating, and then making sure, and there's some technology locked in here, right? If you're getting a new high efficiency boiler, that's great, and you're locked in to that boiler for about 20 years. Do we have the right technology pathways available to change that over time? Anyway, I'm kind of moving on. Energy efficiency has been identified for decades as our cheapest, least cost resource. And so how do we continue to enhance those programs and get those out? And then the specific targets and accountability for greenhouse gas emissions in the built environment, this is more broad reaching, right? This is when you start to think about what's the embodied energy of a building that's under construction. What are the materials being used? What's the end of life look like? Really holistic. Within industry, this was probably one of the most difficult sections of the strategy to address. Because if you think of industry in Washington, it is broad reaching. You've got cross-laminated timber production in Eastern Washington. You've got fossil fuel processing happening in Western Washington, potentially methane down south. You've got aircraft manufacturing, here in Snohomish. It's just across the board, and other things happening in Moses Lake. So you can't come up with kind of a single overarching, this is how we're going to approach industry. Each industry might be exposed to intensive trade outside of the state and outside of the country, and we don't want to lose these industries. And in fact, it's a net gain for the globe, the more of these industries that are producing on our clean grid. So again, the idea is to electrify what we can, invest in research and development and deployment through various mechanisms to create that next generation of technology that will allow another process to be electrified in whole or in part. Work with all these other jurisdictions to make sure that we have comprehensive policy that prevents the flight of industry to other places. I mentioned R&D and green hydrogen production, right? So that's one of the things, interesting opportunity for liquid fuels processing that's happening is they already work with hydrogen. And what else can be done to increase that production and shift production from fossil fuels to hydrogen production and push that into the pipeline. Electricity, so Washington already has, if you didn't know, I think it was last year, I don't know where I am in time and space these days, last year, maybe 2 years ago, we passed the Clean Energy Transformation Act, which is what I call the 100% Clean Act, moving all electricity production away from carbon generating resources. And so again, you have this call for increased transmission between states and regionally, coordinating with other states regionally. There are some regulatory bodies that don't exist in the West that do exist in other parts of the US. Near and dear to my heart is developing more distributed energy resources. So these are things like solar, batteries, stationary batteries, demand response. So that might be, a good way to think about that might be a cold storage facility that can change when they're cooling their freezer. Or in a building, there's a great example in Bellevue from years ago of Microsoft changing when their HVAC systems turn on, and they were able to shave, I think it was like $240,000. It was either a month or per year in demand charges from PSE, right? So those are demand response kinds of activities. Really exciting one to me is, each of us has a hot water heater. They're megawatt hours. Megawatt hours is a lot, if you don't think in megawatts very often, of storage in all of our water heaters, where we could be using that as thermal storage when the sun is shining or some other renewable resources happening. So there's some serious barriers to adopting these technologies where we just don't quite know how to measure the full value of these resources on the distribution grid. Right, the grid operates at a transmission level and then a distribution level. Distribution being getting things to our homes and businesses. And Washington has one of the lowest rollouts of smart meters in the nation. So we just don't have access to that information that I was talking about, where it's like, well, how do we make this better? Well, we don't know because distribution's a black box right now. So we need to unlock that capability. which allows us to not have to go out to California or to Arizona. We can actually increase our resiliency and independence here in Washington. And then making sure that the market mechanisms are working for us. So what does all this cost? It took me a minute to understand this chart. I had to read the narrative behind it a little bit. Let me see if I can explain it. So the chart on the left, net cost of decarbonization. So if you think of a cost curve, you know, prices as we make these investments in the beginning, those investments are going to be expensive, but they pay for themselves over time. So you have a cost curve that kind of goes up and then comes down as those benefits start to get realized. Well, the net change as a percentage of our GDP, that average increase in prices ends up being about 0.3% of GDP in the electrification case. And you can see the other cases here. The chart makes it look, you know, a pretty stark indifference, but, you know, I ask myself that, you know, if we could decarbonize all of Washington's economy for 0.3% of GDP, that seems like a really sound investment to me. And I think to reinforce that is this chart on the right, is the net cost in 2050. So once we get to the other side of that cost curve, where we're realizing the benefits 30 years from now, is it more expensive to decarbonize? Well, it turns out in the electrification case, it's actually cheaper to decarbonize over the next 30 years. But you have to make those investments now, right? It's a choice that so many of us are faced with as we make new investments, is, you know, just that upfront cost for the long-term gain. But as an average Washingtonian, what does that look like for me? And that's what this chart is showing. Where yes, electricity costs are the share of your paycheck going to electricity costs is going to go up, right? Because you're not charging at the pump, or you're not going to the pump to fill up. You're charging at home, so you're going to be spending more in electricity. There's going to be some clean fuels expenditures, you know, some buying new car and the associated maintenance. But it's offset where we're not spending as much on natural gas, and more significantly, is we're not spending as much on liquid fuels. And so net, you're looking at an annual savings of $132 a year for a Washingtonian. And one of the things that I think about in this is you're also removing yourself from the volatility of some global markets associated with oil, where a drastic increase or decrease, specifically an increase in oil, is not going to suddenly make you re-budget what's happening in your own home. Should be some more certainty there. What about jobs? Are we going to lose a bunch of jobs? What's going to happen here? And you can see there are some jobs lost between here and 2030 in some specific sectors. And the most of these are in the liquid fuels processing, moving away from fossil technologies, moving into others. There are some, I think the big driver for this drop is seeing some increased costs over the next 10 years. And so companies having to, or businesses and households having to readjust where they're spending their money. And then there's a huge gain over the following 20 years. You see mostly construction, which first gets me excited about those opportunities, but you see it in other sectors as well. And so complicating this a little bit more is you have population change and population shifts in Washington. So even though it looks like there's a dip in some employment, overall you see the dip there in the beginning from COVID, and then you see the recovery happening. You see the investments paying off. You see Washington continue to grow and grow jobs. There's a lot of discussion about our clean tech jobs lower paying. Are they higher paying? And I will at least say for my business, my labor, I have to compete for labor in a competitive market. I employ electricians, I employ apprentices, engineers, salespeople, accountants. There's very few solar specific specialist jobs that we can't train for, or are really, what am I saying, are have some kind of scarcity associated with them, right? So my wages have to be competitive with any other work that's out there. So they are high paying family jobs that we see across these industries. And one of the great things when you think about, say, distributed energy resources and some of these other things that need to happen around transforming transportation and buildings, these jobs are going to be in every community in Washington, which is really exciting in a way that they're not now, right? That's really exciting to me. So I'm going to wrap up here. It's kind of a hard stop, but I really want to get to some of your questions because I think that's where a lot of the fun is. And so I mentioned it before, I think this is really an enormous challenge that the state is taking on. As an entrepreneur, I am endlessly excited by this because I think when I see friction in a process, I'm thinking about solutions. What can we do? And so I think it's going to be very rewarding. It is not just economic rewards. We are going to see environmental rewards, health rewards. I mean, think about air quality in homes as we're getting to cleaner sources of energy and what's happening in marginalized communities. Very exciting opportunities ahead. Washington is not alone in this. We are not the first state to have a goal of 100% clean, and we are not the last. And so that was looked at in the modeling is what happens if Nevada has a 100% clean bill? How does that change the resources that are available to us? What if Indiana has a low carbon fuel standard that creates more demand and increases the prices of decarbonized fuels for Washington, right? So there's a lot of people moving in this direction. We're not alone. We have a chance to be leaders, and we have a chance to learn from other areas as well. I do think we're uniquely poised to succeed at this. We're already starting from a great spot with 60 to 80% of our electricity coming from hydro. One of the things, I'm not originally from Washington. I'm from Texas and North Carolina. And one of the things and I've been out here for 15 years, but one of the things that I love about the Northwest is just how collaborative the Northwest is in solving problems together. There's a great pioneer independent spirit out here and a willingness to help each other out and finding that independence and resiliency. And not only that, we've got a long history of innovation, whether it be through aerospace or software. Many of you probably don't know, but on the east side of the state, we've got a manufacturer of one of the largest manufacturers of utility electrical gear in the state, and another company that's considered the Microsoft of utility software. So we've got those. We've got Idaho National Laboratory just across the border, and Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, as well as a bunch of great research universities. And so I just really think we've got the right ecosystem to take this on. And, I guess a final thought for you will be from a friend of mine that says, every business is a clean tech business. You just don't know it yet. And for those of you that have been in business for a while, I'll just recall what the transition was like to integrate the internet into your business. There are a lot of businesses that did not make that transition and resisted making a transition. And my sister-in-law works for one of those right now, refuses to adopt the new technology that's coming along and making the investment to embrace it. And those companies don't do as well. Some of them fail, or they just don't succeed like their peers do. And so I think there's just a really great opportunity, especially coming out of this pandemic, and thinking about, okay, what were the good things to come out of this disaster? What can we do by design instead? What does the future of work look like where we can reduce vehicle miles traveled? There's a really interesting thing happening right now if you're following real estate, where there's a re-ruralization of Washington happening when you have companies like Amazon or Microsoft and some of these other service-based industries say, 100% remote work is just fine. And you've got a bunch of young people that move to Seattle pursuing these dreams saying, you know what, I can actually afford a house if I go to, Arlington or Aberdeen, or going over to the east side of the state. I can live there and I can work and I can still have a good paying job. So looks like I'm eyeballing the time now. So let's get to the questions. There is a link there. I suggest everyone go and check out the details, see how your industry might be represented or not. Let's go for some questions.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Reeves. I appreciate that. And gosh, and CleanTech is such a large, broad topic. And something that came up in the chat here that Massa, he's asked about what analysis has been done to understand the supply or generation constraints to meet the demand of increased electrification. Can you address that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And if you dive into the technical modeling, and all those appendices are available on the website, there's a lot of analysis there. The constraints are quite real. So it's looking at things such as the residential generation of solar. Actually, I should say, I need to correct that statement. That's not true, because the modeling just was not able to take on what happens when homeowners take on things like demand response and solar. That knowledge just isn't there. The modeling is already using supercomputers, or it takes several days to just run a single model. So you have to make sure all your inputs are right the first time. But on the bulk power grid, quite a bit. And so it's looking at historically, like, what does a low hydro year look like? What if hydro resources are down by 50%? What are the real constraints that happen there? And there's an artificial constraint in there around the transmission, which I was talking about, which is just a magic number of what if we increase transmission to 6 gigawatts? And that still continues to be a constraint. It's not a perfect system. And so there were some guiding principles around resource adequacy and making sure that we don't have things like rolling brownouts as we move into electrification.
Sure. Okay. And we've been very fortunate to have some of our friends from Snohomish County PUD on here. And Susie, she actually reminded us all that the PUD here locally, Snohomish County, is 95% carbon free. And that's a huge accomplishment. We're glad that they're here in our neck of the woods. Also indicating that the PUD, they're able to accommodate the incremental electrification without affecting any kind of carbon-free supply. So that's good news, and that hopefully will kind of coincide and keep escalating as we go farther into this. So you had mentioned, I thought this was interesting, so the gas emissions limit, and I know the next threshold, I think, is basically, I think you said 2040. I guess my question is, what if? What if that doesn't happen?
Yeah, well, I don't know what teeth are in there. I don't know if there are consequences, regulatory or otherwise, if we don't hit that. I mean, as an environmentalist since I was a little kid, I mean, we're just not achieving our goals. We're not going as far as we could. By the time we hit 2050, my boys will be my age. And we have some really difficult conversations around the house around what is human behavior and why are we doing the things that we're doing that affect the world around us in such a negative way. And that's not a conversation I want them to have with their children. So I think in my mind, I go more to the people side of why would we continue to do the things that we know that are not helping the environment around us? They're not helping the people around us. And in some ways, it's not just around us. It's a global impact on the supply chain of these fossils. So what happens if we don't get there? No one, I don't know that anyone's going to get their hand slapped for it, but we're just not accomplishing, I think our true potential.
Sure. Well, and if I heard you correctly, so in 9 years, all new car sales in Washington State will be electric vehicles. Is that correct? Did I understand that correctly?
That's what the modeling is showing.
Okay.
So there's a few different scenarios there. How long does it take the stock to turn over into electric vehicle? And really, the passenger vehicles need to be 100% sales by 2030. And there is a bill that I don't necessarily agree with. I think there's some nuance to be had in it. There is a bill introduced this year to ban new sales by 2030. And it's a very simple bill that just bans new gas car internal combustion engine sales by 2030 and forces the issue. I don't think that's the best for our more rural communities. When I was living in North Carolina, I was in a extremely rural mountain town where you're still driving around the car that's 30 years old because you know how to fix it, you know how to repair it, you know where to get this, you know the junkyard, the guy at the junkyard where you can get a couple of spare parts and keep that thing going, and that opportunity would be eliminated. And I don't think that's the right thing for the resiliency of our communities. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't take efforts to get there.
Yeah. Wow. Well, changing gears a little bit, I have a curiosity question. What is Everett Safe Streets? What is that?
Yeah, so Everett Safe Streets and Housing Hope. So these are two projects that A&R Solar delivered over the last couple of years. Everett Safe Street is, if I remember correctly, through the Catholic Housing Services, it is a housing project, permanent housing for formerly homeless. There's a number of services there, and we were able to provide a large solar array on their roof to reduce their energy costs over time.
Okay.
Around the same time was Housing Hope, which is in downtown Everett, which is a transitional housing. So it's moving people from the streets, giving them training, giving them support to move into permanent housing. And the goal of Housing Hope was to be a net zero building. And I believe we actually got there. We've done one year of energy modeling. We were able to get them to actually having them produce more energy than they consume on site. And this is one of those, what I would consider a participation from a justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, where they are using the savings from the solar and energy efficiency to fund a staff position to educate their their residents on energy matters and sustainability.
Okay. Very familiar with them. They're also partners of ours, so that's nice.
Yeah, they're great.
So just wrapping it up here a little bit, one last question. This is I think that several folks are asking, do we, in the Puget Sound region, so not necessarily just Snohomish County, but Puget Sound region, do we have a particular niche in the CleanTech arena that is specific or gives us a leg up already for all of these goals?
That's a great question, and I would say no. I mean, I come back to my answer earlier around collaboration, where there is a program through the state called the Clean Energy Fund, where funds are released to either our research laboratories. Utilities have used those funds to deploy new technologies to study. Snohomish PUD has a battery on their grid at a substation that was funded through that. I think if you look at the membership of the CleanTech Alliance, you'll really see that it's quite broad. And a lot of these issues are so interconnected. I think that's a really good thing. So while we have had battery manufacturers based here, an interesting thing that happens is that a lot of the clean tech businesses that are based in Washington work somewhere else. Their market is California, or their market is New York, or their market is South Korea. So they're developing technology here to be deployed globally. And because we have kind of rested on our laurels and said, look, we're 98% we're 95% carbon free here, or we're 100% carbon free there. This isn't really a thing that we need to take care of. And this new legislation says, no, no, we're going to take care of this at home and create those opportunities here. And so that we even have fusion companies. There's 3 fusion companies that are based in Washington, which is just incredibly exciting. So, you know, I would encourage people, if you're thinking about innovation or, you know, how you might be able to address the market, check out the CleanTech Alliance, look at the membership. There's a bunch of events there where you can kind of just hear more about these issues. We just had a breakfast series on blockchain technology and energy, hydrogen, got a lot of people there, a lot of really interesting stuff, and it's very active from a policy perspective as well.
Okay, great. Well, Reeves, thank you very much. If we receive more questions, I assume that we can funnel those to you offline and such, but I know that you have a hard stop here, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So thank you, Reeves, very, very much. I mean, this was very insightful. I know it's a very large topic, and you condensed and crammed a lot into a small amount of time. Thank you for your expertise. Appreciate that.
Well, thank you so much for having me here. Yes, definitely send questions my way. I cannot pretend like I've got the answers, but I can maybe help you get in touch with someone who might.
Sure. Just a couple of reminders for those of you online here with us. We obviously we do coffee chats every Tuesday. So our next coffee chats will be on the 26th. And this has to do with the post-election update and Washington's tax strategies for 2021. Extremely important. Also on the 21st, we're hosting a webinar for round 2 for the SBA C-19 relief and PPP application webinar. So if you want to get in on that, because there's still a lot of money out there to be had, the information changes, it's very fluid. So hopefully you'll join us later in the week for that. And then of course, we do have our State of Everett coming up next week. And that should be very helpful, very informative. And it's always nice to hear what Mayor Franklin and some of the other electeds have to say. But with that, thank you again very much for attending. This is Tuesday, so it's Takeout Tuesday. Make sure you go out and support our local restaurants. Get some takeout food for either lunch today or dinner tonight. And again, thank you for attending. Stay safe. We'll talk to you soon. See ya.